Sensitive people are actually like really strong to be
Yes.
able to like feel all of this and, and do it anyway.
Welcome to Sensitive Stories. This episode is for educational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for treatment with a mental health or medical professional. Let's dive in.
If I had, if I had a year left to live,
Mm,
would I say yes or no to this
mm,
experience?
mm.
To spending time with this person, to being on that podcast, to, you know, playing a game of Uno with my kids, to like, what am I going to say yes to?
Mm.
And then within that framework, and what that's done for me, honestly, I've really focused on certain friendships, and I ask myself, like, how do I feel before, during, and after being with someone? And there's this like mindfulness to that experience. And so, yeah, I go after things in that kind of within that framework.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Kind of another sort of deep lens that I see things through too is that I heard this quote and a couple of people have said it in my life recently, but the quote is, we each get two lives. The second one starts when we realize that we just have one.
Oh, that is deep. Once you give
Mhm.
yourself permission to lean in and be in the moment, and I appreciate that you're you're reflecting and saying, how important is this to me? How meaningful is this to me? Is this worth pushing through and being with discomfort? Is this worth facing that anxiety head on? That's a great question to sit with, to know, do I dedicate my precious bandwidth to this? Is this, something I lean into? I'm curious how, you said, I reflect before, during, and after, and that I imagine helps you decide going forward.
Mhm.
Are these the types of people or the types of situations that, I feel deeply connected with? What else tells you to go forward towards the anxiety? How
To
do
go
you
forward.
know when it's something to lean into versus say no to? I'm thinking about that for
Yeah.
myself too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think about, possible outcomes. I think for me, it's also come down to, a lot of mindfulness practice
Mm-hmm.
and really like just really being in touch with how I'm feeling,
Yeah.
what my goals are, what I want in life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I love having, deep conversations with friends and people I really admire
Mm-hmm.
and kind of talking and thinking some of those things through.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoy doing that. But I do really, I never thought I would say this, 10, 20 years ago, but like I love feeling, getting comfortable with feeling uncomfortable.
Hmm. I that surprises me in the context of social anxiety, but it also excites me
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that is possible. Lean in, accept being uncomfortable.
yeah. Like it's
I love
something that we
that.
can all sit with, I think.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that I notice with social anxiety is that many people have this fear that they're going to have to jump in and, develop this fear hierarchy and just knock out the fears and work through,
Mm-hmm.
check off each fear and do scary things and do it in this kind of compact,
Yeah.
high intensity way. And I feel like that doesn't tend to work for highly sensitive people.
It's true. When we think of it, we feel like we have to attack it, to go get really aggressive. Let's see what your mug says. Life begins at the end of your comfort zone.
Someone give that to me.
That's a. It's interesting because when we always hear get out of your comfort zone, get out of your comfort zone. I think there's a couple different ways to do that. We can take a few steps out, or we can feel like we have to leap out
Right.
completely, which for highly sensitive folks can actually get pretty dysregulating. It
Yes,
can get too overwhelming, overstimulating. So, how do you approach? It sounds like you take a gentle approach. Is that true?
I do. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I love to do it that way. And I think, as when I was a kid, I had severe social anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom would call me a shrinking violet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there were so many things that I didn't want to do that I was scared of. As a teen, as a young adult, I have a lot of siblings, and I would look back and I would just tell myself, well, you were shy because you were homeschooled K through eighth grade,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
you were super kind of sheltered and you didn't
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of experiences socially. And so of course you're this way. But
Mm-hmm.
as I talk to my siblings today, we compare and contrast our experiences, I I was one of the more socially anxious. And I'm technically an extrovert.
Yeah. Oh, so you're an extroverted HSP.
Yes, technically, like if I
Okay.
take the Myers-Briggs quiz,
Uh-huh.
I
Yeah.
am, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel that I'm kind of cuspy in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just so deeply socially anxious as a kid. And I just kind of normalized it to make it about my experience when I have siblings that had that same upbringing that did not have social anxiety. But you know what? They're also like not sensitive.
Right, right. So you're having a very different experience in the same environment, having a different temperament, being more highly
This is
sensitive.
something that I'm really passionate about because like this
Yeah.
was my experience and I remember
Yes.
how scary it felt.
Mm-hmm.
And it was unintentional exposure that like
Mm-hmm.
helped me so much. I worked at a grocery store in high school. I had a check stand and I was just, I would talk with hundreds of people
Mm-hmm.
every day. And that helped me a lot.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I also struggled and still struggle some with social anxiety, and what you're saying resonates a lot because when something has meaning or someone feels important to connect with, I'm able to
Mhm.
lean in a lot more easily with it.
Yes, yes.
Also, I worked in a grocery store for many years before becoming a therapist. And it's
Yeah.
true, it does help soften just having that experience,
Hmm.
having those interactions. It really does help just having just being able to try it on
Absolutely. And then
in
just
small
like,
ways.
yeah, and then just such a variety of people that pass through
Mm-hmm.
and different
Yeah.
experiences and kind of adjusting and being highly sensitive and kind of
Mm-hmm.
adjusting for all these different personalities and then going home and deeply processing those experiences.
Yes, exactly. It's true. Yeah, I don't know if this was your experience too, and I've always tried to figure out this is because I'm highly sensitive that I could find myself easily connecting with each of those personalities.
Hmm.
Was that your experience also?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
this great capability to connect, to empathize with all different types of people because we can usually really see people
Hmm.
and see all the different layers, and I usually could find some way that I could relate to them, even if it's
Absolutely.
not everything. But then also we bring in the social anxiety piece, and how did that show up when you were having those interactions, if at all?
Yeah, I think, when I would start my shift, it was bigger and then it would pass through. And I worked at a I worked at a grocery store kind of next door to a studio somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just like interesting, like fun conversations about that, about their work. And it would be like kind of the same people during their lunch breaks. And so
Mm-hmm.
just like developing like a rapport over time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so many like sort of same customers that
Mm-hmm.
it was really supportive.
Yeah, and you said over time things deepened and shifted. I think is that an important part of being with social anxiety is
Yes.
giving yourself time.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I believe, at least for highly sensitive people, I think that there just needs to be an acceptance that
Yeah.
that it's a process and that it takes time. And, when we lean into like getting comfortable, feeling uncomfortable, the things that make us uncomfortable now, if we continue to lean into it, will not make us feel uncomfortable in the future. It will be something else that we'll be leaning into.
Right.
Um, I had this awesome therapist. And I think when my oldest daughter was, when she was, I think she was maybe in kindergarten. And so there was still some social anxiety there for me, not so much maybe one-on-one, but in high conflict or potentially high conflict situations,
Mm-hmm.
it would be there. And I remember there was this particular situation with an event,
Mm-hmm.
a birthday party,
Mm-hmm.
and a play date was canceled because a friend had head
Mm-hmm.
lice. And
Uh-huh.
so, and so, but then that same day, that individual like was at this birthday party.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh no,
Oh
problems,
no.
and
Right.
that felt scary for me, but I, going to remove my daughter from the situation. I said, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not, comfortable with this in light of, having
Yeah.
canceled a play date for this morning.
Right.
And like there was some conflict and it got,
Mm.
uncomfortable. And then I went to my therapist and told him about it, and he chuckled and was like, Louisa, awkward is the new normal.
Oh.
Like you're a parent, like you have kids in like a K through 12 system, like,
Mm-hmm.
and I think in general, like things like that, especially conflict
Mm.
for people with social anxiety and for highly sensitive people, like it can feel uncomfortable and big and awkward. Um,
Yeah.
but when he like normalized it for me like that, I'm
Mm.
like, that was so awkward for me to go through that. And I would have not, not had it any other way. Like that's
Mm.
what I needed to do.
Ooh, it's so clear.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Because I think
Thank you.
as you were telling me that story, I was thinking, oh, this would be so easy to go into people pleasing mode, let the anxiety take over, and not say anything, and maybe
Hmm.
just take the risk of staying at the party.
Hmm.
But you said something in you knew exactly what to do and leaned in to be able to do it. How did you how did you get there?
Maybe the mama bear in me. I
The
just
mama bear.
and I also just like I guess become kind of passionate about just like
Mm-hmm.
doing the hard things.
Yeah.
Because I know each time I do them, they get easier for me.
Yes.
It's that exposure work. Like
Mm-hmm.
it is hard and it
Mm-hmm.
feels big in the moment. But then now, like today, that was quite a few years ago. Like
Mm-hmm.
today, that wouldn't feel for me in my body the way that it felt then.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Like you said, it's a process,
Mhm.
and it gets easier over time. And also, my takeaway from that story is that we also aren't in a. We talked earlier about being in a box. You don't have to be in a box with social anxiety either. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean that you're. There are things that you can do that maybe others would assume wouldn't be possible for someone with social anxiety.
Absolutely. And I think that there's like different experiences in our lives. Like maybe we're going through something, we're adjusting, going
Mm-hmm.
through a major life change. And that might not be the time to, dive in and lean hard
Yeah.
into this. But, so I think it is a process and it really can be sort of like just an overtime process.
Mm-hmm.
And when we feel like we're in that place to just like do it, that then enjoy that and do it. But if you feel like
Mm-hmm.
you're in a place in your life because you're going through hard things and you have social anxiety, um, and you just want to really like stay home more and take gentle
Mm-hmm.
care of yourself and not like face it head on, like then letting that be okay too,
Mm-hmm.
I think is important.
It's so important to honor where we are as sensitive people, that it's okay to say, I need to go more inward right now. I
Yeah.
need to recharge. I need to take care of myself. It's okay to look at what you have available when you're
Mhm.
making choices about how much to lean into those edges, to the social anxiety or to whatever it is that's feeling uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, there were times where I just, like when I had my first daughter, that I just sort of, just that wasn't the time for me
Mm-hmm.
to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I was
And did that
adjusting,
You were adjusting, exactly. And we need
and that
lots
was
of like
big.
adjustment time, especially
Hmm.
for big life changes, big life events and transitions. When you were giving yourself that time, did it feel welcoming, or was there a little bit of a, was there a kind of a battle inside? Or were you able to accept that it's okay to take this time? I've just had a child. It's okay not to push myself so much.
Yeah. I think that it was a battle at
Mm-hmm.
first. You
Mm-hmm.
know, when we talk about like our sensitive story and kind of how that all
Mm-hmm.
came about, like
Mm-hmm.
this is my sensitive story,
Mm.
having my first daughter. I think I wanted to get out there. I was in these mom groups. I had done prenatal yoga and I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
like socialize and stay connected. And our babies were around the same ages.
Mm-hmm.
And that felt like that sounded like it would feel good to me.
Mm.
And then my oldest was just, she knew what she wanted when she wanted it and what she didn't want when she didn't want it. And
Mm-hmm.
she was very, even as like a little baby, she was like so vocal and, had these strong preferences for which
Mm-hmm.
carrier. And like they had, all these different baby carriers with different fabrics. And like there was this one that she loved and like didn't like the rest of them. She wanted to be held, she wanted to be soothed. There were
Mm.
things, like white noise machines that she liked, ones that she would cry. And I'm just like, this
Mm.
is hard. Like, this is a lot.
Yeah.
And so I ultimately just kind of leaned into like, okay, like I want to get out of the house. I want to connect and I kind of need to figure this out.
Mm-hmm.
And somewhere in that first year, I read an article about highly sensitive people.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read that article, I just was like, okay, they're describing my daughter. Like this is my baby. This is
Mm-hmm.
this is what I got. And so like how am I going to like adapt, our
Mm-hmm.
worlds to kind of um be supportive
Mm-hmm.
of both of us and like meeting our needs. And then
Mm-hmm.
it was really like in doing that kind of deep dive and research and reading, Dr. Erin's books. I think at that time she had like the highly sensitive person and the highly sensitive child
Mm-hmm.
were out. Um, and I just like read them. And as I was reading them, I was like, oh, she's talking about me too. Like, this is me. I
Yes.
am totally highly sensitive, and so
Mm-hmm.
is she. And so yeah, that's how I realized that I
Mm.
was. And so my oldest is 11 and a half now. And
Uh-huh.
so it's been over 10 years since I realized that. Um, and it's been life-changing for me.
Mm-hmm.
I just, I see the world differently. I take care of
Mm.
myself differently. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's just so many things that I've just like adopted into
Mm-hmm.
my lifestyle at this point in time in that journey that I just kind of do on autopilot now, you know?
Yeah, I love that you. What a sweet experience to share that with your daughter.
Mm,
That your sensitive stories overlap in such a way.
hmm
And I hear
hmm
that from a lot of parents. That's how they discover that they are highly sensitive through wanting to support their child and learn
Yeah.
about their child. When you said it's like, oh, taking care of our needs, taking
hmm
care of her meant taking care of you. Such a
Yeah.
beautiful experience.
Thank you.
And it sounds like it maybe woke up a lot in you.
hmm
Did it,
hmm
when I discovered that I was highly sensitive, I really looked back and kind of rewrote my story through that lens. Did you have a similar
Yes.
experience?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. I looked back at my childhood and I think it helped me, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
to give a lot more compassion to my parents.
Mm.
Like that, they struggled and they're humans and like I wasn't like some of my other siblings and
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't that easy for
Mm-hmm.
them and like they didn't know
Yeah.
what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then yeah, I talked to my siblings and we describe our childhood so differently.
Mm-hmm.
There were things for me that were not, really not nurturing and supportive that
Mm-hmm.
impacted me. And, another one of my siblings might just kind of normalize that and it wasn't a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And like, and they're not sensitive and I am.
Right.
Because,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
going back to like that differential susceptibility piece, like where
Yeah.
we're more helped or more harmed by our environment. And
Mm-hmm.
I like what PMLity kind of describes like a less than nurturing childhood, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And like it was that for me. And
Mm-hmm.
did it impact like my other siblings in the same way, especially my like not so sensitive, non-sensitive siblings? Like, no, it didn't.
Yeah.
It was, they will tell you a different story about their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for me, things um, hit really deeply. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's true. When we're in the same household but have different temperaments, the experience is very different.
Hmm.
And your siblings, sounds like they were getting enough or
Hmm.
close to enough, but when you're highly sensitive, the needs are so different. And like you said with your daughter, she was responding to the textures in her baby carriers and the white noise machines. There's
Hmm.
just so much more to pay attention to with a
Yes.
sensitive child, and we often get missed, or
Hmm.
those deeper needs don't get met. We don't get seen. It sounds like you were having that experience
Hmm.
too.
Definitely. And I think
Yeah.
I come from a large family and like I think
Mm-hmm.
a few of my siblings did feel that way as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I just I was stubborn, you know.
Uh huh.
I was. And like there were things that I was told or made to do that I wouldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, and sometimes it was because of the high sensitivity, sometimes it was because of the social anxiety that I would just refuse to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it can be, we can kind of be made to be like the bad child or the difficult child,
Mm-hmm.
you know, if we're not doing these things that we're expected to do, especially when you couple being a highly sensitive person with social anxiety. There's
Mm-hmm.
going to be a lot of things that we're going to say no to.
Yes, exactly. And that we need to say no to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
How do you, when you look back, how do you see your sensitivity showing up? You said one way was the social anxiety, perhaps being maybe more overstimulated,
Hmm.
more impacted. When you look back now, where else do you realize it was showing up? You talked about being maybe a difficult child, but I'm curious in what
Hmm.
ways.
Um, there were just experiences like that I would say no to. Like, for example, like one of my parents is Jewish, one of them is Catholic, and I was
Mm-hmm.
raised like more Catholic when I was a kid and then more
Mm-hmm.
Jewish when I was a teen.
Mm-hmm.
But we were supposed to go to confession, and that was like a
Mm-hmm.
thing that we were supposed to do.
Right.
And I went one time and felt very uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
and I wouldn't do it again. And in hindsight, a lot of that had to do with, um, I think both being highly sensitive and with social anxiety. And social anxiety is, this deep fear of judgment. And we go to a confessional
Mm-hmm.
to share, like, all
Right.
the things that we did wrong. And then,
Right.
like, for someone with social anxiety
Yes.
disorder, that can be really scary.
Incredibly scary.
Yeah.
To,
Yeah.
to put yourself in the place of judgment or potential
Exactly.
judgment, right? Where you have to
Exactly.
confess. Oh, that's really uncomfortable
Yeah. And so
and
I think
scary.
like for parents with like highly sensitive kids and kids
Mm-hmm.
potentially with social anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
you know, thinking about like, well, how can we do this in a way, and how can we help them?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, because I was a bad kid for not going to confession.
Right, and we get labeled, right? I was
Yeah.
talking with a client yesterday and just remembering the impact of being labeled. So
Hmm.
being labeled a bad kid. When
Hmm.
really, if we peel it back, it's that you were uncomfortable, you were anxious.
Hmm.
What did you need instead?
I needed understanding. I
Mm-hmm.
needed I needed someone to kind of sit with me and ask what I needed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in that moment, what were my fears? Like, what was I really afraid of? Because I believe I could have articulated that,
Yeah, right,
even at the age of 7, like why I felt
right,
uncomfortable. But it was more just like, do what you're told because they said so kind of mentality.
right.
And yeah, I would have loved like understanding
Mm-hmm.
and support and like a gentleness there, but it was like,
Mm-hmm.
you're stubborn, you're getting a
Mm-hmm.
consequence.
Right. It was more just matter of fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of sensitive kids are missing is just someone to slow down with them.
Hmm.
Because you're like what you said, the feelings are there. Often they can be articulated just with a little bit of help.
Hmm.
And even as adults, we can do that with ourselves.
Yes, yes. That's one of my like favorite practices, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot where I heard it, but I heard that kind of like throughout the day, like asking yourself, like, what do I need right now?
Yeah.
And whether that's like when we're eating a meal or when we're going to the bathroom or when we're driving, like just having that be sort of like an automatic check-in time, like
Mm-hmm.
what do I need right now?
Mm-hmm.
And when asked the question, we often can articulate it, at any age. Um, and yeah, that wasn't, my experience as a kid, but it's something I can do for myself now that I do.
That's right. It can be as simple as pausing and saying to yourself, what do I need now? Asking yourself, what do I need now? And just seeing what comes through.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, creating that space. How do we pull apart maybe discomfort from anxiety? Are they the same?
A great question.
Are
Um,
they on a spectrum? Just thinking about that.
yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, maybe I would put them on a spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
just like anxiety can be like a little bit uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
to extremely exceptionally.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, I think I would probably put them on a continuum, like kind
Mm-hmm.
of hanging out together.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, like with nervous and
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, doing the things that make us a little bit uncomfortable, maybe a
Yeah.
little bit anxious, especially with social anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
but not just like I'm gonna go knock this out 10 out of 10 right now. Like,
Right.
like let me just go after my biggest fear. Like that's not gentle and like that often
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work well in our process. But yeah, I think I would let them hang out
Yeah.
together on a continuum.
Yeah. For me, it helps thinking. Okay, if I'm just uncomfortable or I'm a little bit nervous, then I know it's okay to lean in. But if I'm highly anxious, maybe it's a time to lean away.
Hmm.
When I'm asking myself what I need, I can often will check in like, okay, what's the level?
Yeah.
And that will tell me
Yeah.
how to respond. Because it can be
Hmm.
hard to know, like you were talking about earlier, there's this expectation just to do the thing,
Hmm.
no matter what. In a
Yeah.
sense that people were often expected just show up how everyone else is showing up.
Hmm.
And that's not always the best choice for our nervous systems.
Yeah, it's really not. I recently started playing pickleball, and so I
Mm-hmm.
was like, like performance anxiety. I want to get that serve in the right
Right?
place. My teammates counting on me.
Yeah.
Um, but so I did a couple of lessons and I did like some
Mm-hmm.
small group things and just kind of eased into it.
Mm-hmm.
And like doing like relaxation exercises before I like serve, like
Yeah.
mentally, and like in
Mm-hmm.
my body, to just like slow down.
Mm.
And then with each time, I think about it less and less, and it just comes more easily. But it's this sort of gentle process. Like I wasn't going to just jump in, having never played tennis or pickleball before,
Right.
and then like just go to open play, and like, be a deer in headlights.
Right.
I went for this kind of gentle route to like have
Mm.
an intro into it.
I think that's a great taking the gentle route is a great approach for anything in life as an
Hmm.
HSP.
Yeah.
Giving ourselves permission to slow down, check in along the way,
Hmm.
take it step by step with lots of space in between. Like with pickleball, okay, first you're gonna just hang out on the court,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
maybe watch some pickleball videos,
Yeah.
or talk about pickleball,
Yeah.
or just hold the racket or whatever it's called, um,
Hmm.
and then yeah, maybe slowly play 1-to-1, and then play with a team or
Hmm.
a quad. I don't know much about pickleball.
I remember Brene Brown talking about getting into it, and I was like, oh, let me try that
Oh yeah,
too. I love her, so I was like, yeah,
she's great.
yeah, I really
Yeah.
like her work and her
Mm-hmm.
content a lot. And when it comes to like social anxiety and public speaking, I love how she
Mm-hmm.
talks about, maybe she isn't talking about social anxiety, but for me it
Mm-hmm.
feels relevant, getting into
Mm-hmm.
the arena and
Yes.
and doing the thing.
Yeah.
And then with social anxiety in that context, the fear is okay, because social anxiety is this big fear, intense fear of
Mm-hmm.
judgment. And then when we get into the arena and there's, more than one person, it's multiple people who, will hear
Mm-hmm.
what we say. I think that can be super anxiety provoking,
Mm-hmm.
but we're doing the thing of getting into the arena and
Right.
doing things that scare us. And she talks about like not listening to the people in the cheap seats, like
Right.
they're not
The
down there in there
hecklers.
with you. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. How how do we not listen to the hecklers or the the judgments? Is there a way to maybe push that a little outside of ourselves?
Yeah, I have like different strategies that I like to use for that.
Mm-hmm.
Like a little one that I've adopted is like I think this came from like an intervention for kids, but I
Mm-hmm.
love it for adults too.
Mm-hmm.
It's like whatever the comments are that are made,
Mm-hmm.
we just kind of envision them like in a like a ball.
Mm-hmm.
And then we decide as it approaches, as the judgment, the comment approaches, like, is this true? We're assessing it. And if we feel like, this is something true, this is something I can learn from and I will take into consideration in the future, then we can like take it in and we can receive
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something that we're like, wow, that was just mean-spirited and unkind and
Mm-hmm.
unnecessary and just came from a really like a low vibe kind of place,
Mm-hmm.
then we can just take it and like, you know, just let
Yeah.
it break on the ground, just
Yes.
throw it, let it crash.
Mm.
If it's something where we're like, there might be a little bit of truth there. I don't know about that part. Then we just kind of
Mm-hmm.
imagine like it's like this little ball on our shoulder,
Yeah.
and we just like let it sit there, and we decide what parts we'll take as we kind of, as we do as
Mm.
HSP, we deeply process and we just kind of
Yeah.
consider it, and then we decide whether or not we want to take it in.
I love that because we're so suited for that processing.
Hmm.
And to look at people's intentions, we can easily feel into that if we take the time to
Yes.
slow down and
Yeah.
reflect.
Yes.
And then it's much easier to digest the information and see what is useful for me here. And what can
Hmm.
I love that metaphor, just throw the ball of feedback and let it smash
Yeah.
on the ground.
Yeah,
Let it
because
break.
that's where some of it needs to go because it's
Yes.
trash and it's mean-spirited. And
Yeah.
I think there's like kind of a shielding process to taking
Mm-hmm.
on those judgments, you know, and there's also like an acceptance of like there will be judgment and
Mm-hmm.
not all people are for us and we're not for
That's
all
right.
people. And like
That's right.
we're speaking to our people. We are being like deep and
Mm.
raw and real
Yeah.
and like our people will see us and we will
That's
see
right.
them in that process. And I think with social anxiety, there can often be a real fear of being seen,
Mm-hmm.
a deep fear of being seen.
Yeah.
And a way that I kind of like to look for social anxieties is like to ask the question, like, is there anything that you'd love to be doing right now that
Mm-hmm.
you're fearful of doing?
Mm-hmm. Right. What are you holding yourself back from doing?
Yeah, because I think a lot of times and one of the reasons I really leaned into social anxiety in my practice was because in specializing and working with highly sensitive people, I was seeing a lot of social anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started kind of looking for it more and more because it wasn't necessarily what people were clearly expressing like that they were coming in for, but it was like the layer there that was getting in
Mm.
the way of getting that job that they wanted or
Yeah.
going on the dates or having like those deep connected friendships and community
Mm-hmm.
that they like longed for.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and I just as I saw more and more of it. So
But I
both
think,
of my daughters are highly sensitive, but
mm-hmm.
like so differently so.
Oh, I'd love to hear
Um,
more about it.
Yeah, so like, and I did ask their permission to
Great.
talk
I love
about
that.
them. But they're 11 and a half and 7.5. And they just like couldn't be more different, yet
Mm-hmm.
they're both sensitive. My older one is just like, more calm and like introverted. And
Mm-hmm.
my little one is just like, high intensity, extremely
Mm-hmm.
energetic. Um, but I think little things that like came up in raising them that knowing it was just so valuable to know that they're highly sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
um One of my favorite little stories about my older daughter with being sensitive is that one of her favorite meals when she was, 3, 4 years old was chicken tikka masala.
Uh-huh.
And then I remember exactly like everything and where it was at the time. And she was sitting there and she said, Mom, you know how they call this chicken tikka masala? It's not actually like a chicken, right? And she
Yeah.
was 4. I think she had just turned 4. And I had to tell her the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. And she
Yeah.
like, I think she spit her food out.
Mm-hmm.
She shoved it away. She
Mm-hmm.
said, like, I don't eat animals. I love animals. Like, I'm not going to do
Mm-hmm.
that. I don't want to. Like, to this
Yeah.
day, hasn't eaten meat since.
That empathy coming through.
Yeah. And like
Yeah.
when there's like, holidays and birthdays, like
Mm-hmm.
she'll like want to donate to like an animal, like wildlife refuge or
Oh
something.
wow.
Just like this deep, passion for animals and just, yeah, so much empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think one of the things that I hear Dr. Aaron talk about
Mm-hmm.
that I just love so much, and it kind of speaks to like, and maybe I kind of go on the extreme a little bit about it, but kind of hanging out in the, you know, embracing whatever it is that I need as a highly sensitive person, but also getting uncomfortable.
Yeah. Finding that balance.
Yeah. And so
Mm-hmm.
kind of like that push-pull thing. And I think it's so valuable in raising kids. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's sort of, a protective element where I'm advocating for like the kind of warm, a warm, fuzzy teacher, whoever that is,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what works best for
Yeah.
my kids and like just doing that advocacy to help set
Mm-hmm.
them up to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think has been like so important for me. But then also kind of like um letting them get uncomfortable and like have these experiences. And like if you would have told me then that like my kids are going to be playing travel soccer, super intense,
Mm-hmm.
playing in a position called center attacking midfielder.
Oh wow.
I mean, because travel soccer is so intense. Like,
Oh, it sounds like it.
yeah, but this is what they chose and like what they
Yeah.
pursue. And it's super intense, but like,
Mm-hmm.
but they know what to do to take care of themselves now, kind of in between
Mm-hmm.
even in like busy tournaments, like there's things that they do, that like I didn't know they did. My older one, as we were talking, and I told
Uh-huh.
her about this podcast, and she was excited, and she was like, "Yeah, you can talk about me." And I learned some things about her like that I didn't know.
Mm.
That, she told me like soccer is actually a meditation for me.
Oh, beautiful. Wow.
And
At 11.
at 11, yeah.
Yeah.
And she was like,
Mm.
how I take like really powerful kicks. She'll like
Mm.
take the penalty kicks sometimes or like the corner
Mm-hmm.
kicks, and they're strong. And like people have sometimes said that she has like a big boot, which I guess means that she has a powerful kick.
Uh.
She was like, well, I never told you this before, but like, but when I
Mm.
take those kicks, like the reason that they're so strong is because I take everything that's happened to me since the last time I played soccer, and I'm
Mm.
standing there and I just think about it and I just like send it all to my
Mm.
foot and I let it
Wow.
go.
Wow.
It's like,
It gives me chills.
yeah, I'm like, I
I
didn't know
see.
that.
That's incredible. Just the awareness and the relationship to emotion at such a young
Hmm.
age. And I see you
Hmm.
getting emotional about it.
Hmm.
And it just, I imagine, you talk about, sensitivity being strong. And is that
Hmm.
where that comes from? From your daughter?
Yeah, and
Oh,
actually like
that's so
the
beautiful.
domain name, for my website, strongandsensitive.com,
Yeah.
like it actually came from my oldest
From
daughter.
her. Yeah.
I started my private practice in 2019, and so
Mm-hmm.
she was around 6 years old. And I
Yeah.
told her like I want to start a private practice and work for myself. And
Yeah.
I've just loved working with sensitive people. And so I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking something, with the word sensitive or
Yeah.
sensitivity. And she got quiet for a while.
Mm.
And then she was like, I like that. And that's true. But I think that maybe you should include something about being strong.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, can you tell me some more about that? And she was like, well, going to school all day, like all those bright lights on the ceiling, like having all these experiences that we have no control over. it's so overwhelming and it's really hard, even with like a kind, gentle teacher, it's still a lot,
Mm-hmm.
aftercare, like whatever it is, like it's a
Mm-hmm.
lot. And, just being subject to some of like the really mean things that can be said
Mm-hmm.
in school settings. And she was like, I think that it's harder to do that as a sensitive person.
Yep.
And so I think that sensitive people are actually like really strong to be
Yes.
able to like feel all of this and, and do it anyway. So I think we're
Mm-hmm.
strong and sensitive.
So insightful.
Yeah,
Because
we're
that's just
great
something
kids.
I'm starting to realize recently.
Yeah, yeah,
I think it sounds like a testament to how much you've poured into your children, that they are able to go out and do all these things and defy the typical HSP stereotype because they have all the support and care and attunements. It's a reminder of what we are capable of
yeah.
when we get when we get our needs
Exactly.
met.
It's that differential susceptibility piece that like
Exactly.
we can be more helped and like
Yes.
thrive with like, and that's not to
Mm-hmm.
say there weren't really hard things that happened. Like there were some
Sure.
really hard things that happened
Mm-hmm.
that they've overcome
Mm-hmm.
and, with support. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's amazing. Like it's
Yeah.
really amazing. So yeah, I love the strong and sensitive concept. And then
Mm-hmm.
after she said that, I kind of pondered on that for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought about because I used to work in like community mental health and
Mm-hmm.
in substance use treatment centers and in school
Mm-hmm.
settings and like, gang involved populations and like,
Mm-hmm.
and among all of those, there were, tons of highly sensitive people,
Mm-hmm.
people who lived on places like Skid Row who just
Mm-hmm.
had like traumatic experience after
Yeah.
traumatic experience happen to them or getting bullied
Mm-hmm.
or, watching people like overdose and like these really
Mm-hmm.
intense,
Yeah.
awful experiences. And they were so strong. Like they just
Yes.
keep getting up and
Mm-hmm.
doing, doing the day over and over again. But yeah, it just made sense to me. It clicked. And I was like,
Yeah.
she's onto something. She's
She,
right.
she's exactly right. And it's such a good reminder that life doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have the perfect amount of support
Hmm.
to overcome trauma, to overcome
Hmm.
hardship, to flourish, to thrive.
Yes.
Uh, a little goes a long way. Like you said, with the differential
Uh,
susceptibility,
Yeah.
we're hurt more, but we're also helped more.
Yeah, like in therapy, like,
Yeah,
just so many highly sensitive clients are just like, please give me the book recommendations, like tell me the
exactly.
podcast, like
Right.
send me like all of the things, like, what
Mm-hmm.
meditations, like I want all
Yeah.
of it. I want to read everything. And like sometimes like,
Mm-hmm.
when that's where they're at and they're just like wanting to work intensely, like
Mm-hmm.
it is it is like a deep and sometimes a quick process, when that's
Yeah.
the energy that they're bringing.
Exactly. And sometimes in the anxiety piece can shut us down, but if we're able to lean in a little bit more,
Hmm.
so much becomes available. So just being
Yeah,
careful not to get stuck in the perceived limitations of sensitivity because
absolutely.
it's a lie.
It is a lie. It
Mm-hmm.
does that does not need to be true for us at all.
That's right. And
Even with difficult experiences. Like
mm-hmm.
I had a lot of really difficult experiences,
Mm-hmm.
especially as a kid, and
Mm-hmm.
things don't have to stay that way.
That's right. They don't have to stay that way. I'm the same. I often am surprised at what I'm doing now based on what I went through earlier. And I
Hmm.
really do think it's because of my sensitivity,
Yeah.
because I've been able to use that as a resource and am so impacted by what I'm able to give myself now. And
Hmm.
because I see a lot of people that grew up similarly the way I did that are not thriving.
Yeah.
And so
Same.
it is helpful to remember, okay, sensitivity can actually be quite an asset.
Hmm. Yeah, like
And
that ability, like the intuition that often comes along with
yes,
it and kind of
exactly.
intuiting things about people.
Mm-hmm.
I think, it is so valuable. It can get tricky sometimes, that
Mm-hmm.
piece coupled with social anxiety because we're
Mm-hmm.
like looking, for that
Right.
judgment. But yeah, it's super valuable.
Mm-hmm. It is. If there was one message that you could share with HSPs who are on the journey to accepting themselves more deeply, who may be struggling with social anxiety, is there a message you could leave them?
I would say that, whatever you want is
Mm-hmm.
possible.
Mm.
Whatever it is that you want in life is possible. With social anxiety, it's often on the other side of bravery, but it doesn't have to be, super intense and difficult. And, it can be a slower, gentler process. But yeah, there's so much beauty on the other side of that. And that not everybody has to like us. They really don't. Like they really don't. And kind of
Mm-hmm.
accepting that I think is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think that it's so important to just like let the beauty within each of us like radiate and shine, um, because it's there. And I think oftentimes with social anxiety, we're hiding beautiful parts of ourselves, for fear of being judged. And then, like, the connections and the people that we want to draw in can't really see us if we're not
Yeah.
like really sharing and showing who we are and like all of the beauty that's within us. So I think it would just be to like, show yourself and, just looking past any of the negativity that's out
Mm-hmm.
there. Not all people are for us, and we're not for all people, and that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah, and if we as we open ourselves up more, we might create opportunities for more connection as well. Not just
Absolutely.
judgment. There's more possible
Yeah,
than
yes,
the fear
like
is telling us.
exactly,
Mm-hmm.
exactly.
Well, Lisa, I want to thank you so much. I wonder if there's anything else that you wanted to share that we didn't get to.
So many thoughts,
Yeah.
so many things. I feel like I could talk about this for so many hours.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I love this topic so much. I
Mm-hmm.
think I think one thing that I would love to touch on is just
Mm-hmm.
that, um, sometimes there's sort of like a combination of things that that I see in the clients that I get to support. Um, Things like, the perfectionism, along
Yes.
with high sensitivity, along with social anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
along with some like relational anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and by that I kind of mean like attachment wounds
Mm-hmm.
and how that shows up and often kind of complicates the social anxiety
Yeah.
experience,
Mm-hmm.
and really teasing apart, is it that, anxious or avoidant or disorganized attachment wounding
Mm-hmm.
that's telling me that I have to grip on so tightly to this
Yes.
connection, or a fear, that I'll be
Mm-hmm.
abandoned? And when that's coupled with social anxiety,
Mm.
I think it's really important to kind of tease all of those elements apart to
Mm-hmm.
see what's what,
Mm-hmm.
as a clinician, and also like, for clients to kind of think about, what is my attachment style? If I'm
Mm-hmm.
anxiously attached and I have social anxiety,
Right.
um, how can I work through both of those things? Because
Mm-hmm.
they are, while they're two distinct, unique
Mm-hmm.
experiences, sometimes I do see them show up
Yeah.
in someone, and those are worked through differently. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's important to know.
Right, to maybe look a little bit closer to see what other components are intersecting with your sensitivity, with your social anxiety.
Exactly. With your high sensitivity, if there's
Right.
like traits of codependence, like, where we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at like extreme people pleasing and like
Yeah.
extreme fear of setting boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
like where is that coming from? But yeah,
Right.
to look at like, the kind of interconnectedness of those
Mm-hmm.
elements and kind of see like if any of those things are true for us,
Mm-hmm.
because those are different processes, different experiences.
Right. How would one start, even just what would the first step be in starting to tease codependency, anxious attachment, or insecure attachment,
Hmm.
social anxiety apart? What does that process look like at the beginning?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, knowing if we're highly sensitive, like
Mm-hmm.
there's a process for each one of those elements that you
Right.
mentioned, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's an HSP quiz that we can take,
Right.
right? I'm sure there's, things online that we can look at. Like, do we have social anxiety?
Yes.
We can look at, do we have codependence? Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's amazing resources out there for
Mm-hmm.
that I love. There's all of these attachment style quizzes. And what I
Mm-hmm.
love about some of them is they don't just say, oh, you are anxiously attached.
Right.
They'll show you, like, I'm thinking of one in particular, they'll show you like this pie and
Mm-hmm.
it's like, anxious, avoidant, disorganized, secure. And so you can see like that pie. And I think that in some of the questions, I'll actually talk about it, not just from like a romantic relationship perspective,
Mm-hmm.
but also in friendship. And I think a common misconception is that, anxious and avoidant attachment are more like a romantic relationship thing.
Right.
And they're not. Like they show up in friendship constantly.
Yeah, all our relationships.
Yeah. At
Right?
work, with our boss, with our family.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Anyone we're interacting with on a regular basis, we might see that show up, would you say?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think, and the more mindful we are, the more, present we are with it, the more we're
Mm-hmm.
using all of these different skills and tools that we've kind of put in our back pocket that we know work best for us.
Mm-hmm.
We can use them in these situations and they can
Right.
really, really help us. Um, I digress a little bit, but I love the concept for people who just are like, I don't meditate, I'm not into it, I don't
Mm-hmm.
have time for it, I can't sit still. Like something that I've adopted that worked for me, and frankly, because I kind of was like that, you
Mm-hmm.
know, um, is to listen, a practice of listening to meditations as if like they're a podcast.
Ooh, yeah. Let's let it wash over you.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
because like we often get so, especially with social anxiety, we can get
Mm-hmm.
really in our heads and like do a lot of negative, really soul-crushing self-talk that's
Mm-hmm.
really, really hurtful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I'll say like, just like when you're getting ready in the morning, maybe not while driving, of course, but when you're getting ready, when you're taking a nature walk, just listen to some meditations that
Mm-hmm.
really give you that positive self-talk. If it feels hard
Yeah.
for you to put that there.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to meditations like a podcast.
I think it's a great suggestion because sometimes our nervous systems will actually go into higher alert with stillness,
Hmm.
especially if we've had
Hmm.
trauma or we're in maybe a
Yeah.
more chronically anxious state. So it's actually not helpful to be still. We need to be discharging that anxious
Hmm. Hmm.
energy,
Yes.
that over arousal state. So yeah, movement meditation,
Hmm.
active meditation is just as
Yeah.
valuable,
Yeah.
especially if that's what you're needing. It goes back to checking in with yourself. What do I need, and can I give myself permission to lean into that need and show up differently than I see other people showing up? It's okay to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially if we're like a highly sensitive person and we're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with conflict or we're socially
Exactly.
anxious and highly sensitive and dealing with
Mm-hmm.
conflict, like maybe that walking meditation, it's just what we need right before that, anticipated interaction.
Exactly. Well, just like you shared before pickleball, you get into a more relaxed state to help
Hmm.
ease some of those nerves. And we can do that with anything,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you talked about the before, during, and after of social experiences. I think that's a good suggestion for anything we do. Can we
Hmm.
take a moment to process and charge ourselves up before, or take a moment to check in during what's
Hmm.
what's this experience like for me, and then after process and fill ourselves back up
Absolutely.
again.
I love that.
We
Yeah.
apply
Like
it
with
to
conflict.
everything.
Yeah.
With conflict,
Yeah.
exactly.
How about
Right.
feel before this and then during. And like, I think the more mindful I've become
Mm-hmm.
amidst conflict, like I'm like present in my body
Mm-hmm.
for it, like
Exactly.
the more I'm able to kind of, this might sound like an oxymoron, but kind of like relax into the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just, yeah, just being like really present and saying what's true for me and not being overly passive or overly aggressive or passive aggressive in that conflict, but
Right.
not letting like the delivery undermine the message of what I want to
Mm.
communicate.
Yes.
I'm saying what's true, and
Mm-hmm.
I can best do that like when I'm really present.
Yes, exactly. Allowing yourself that time to reflect and check in and check what is the message I'm wanting to communicate
Hmm.
and how can I best deliver that message. We,
Yeah.
yeah, we actually talked in another episode about taking breaks during conflict, and I just love that you also brought that up.
Yeah, I think conflict is huge for
Yes,
HSPs. I think
absolutely.
that it's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And we throw in social anxiety and it's
Mm-hmm.
all the harder.
Exactly.
Um, I also, if it's possible, I like to think about like two or three key points in
Mm.
advance if I'm anticipating a conflict,
Smart.
because I know like it can feel dysregulating to be in like,
Mm-hmm.
especially if it's, extremely negative,
Yeah.
even toxic conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Um, two to three key points that I want to get across if I
Mm-hmm.
feel like dysregulated that I've really
Yeah.
thought deeply about that I want to get across.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's easier for them to kind of come to mind, even in the midst of all of
Mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah, to have those anchor points
Exactly.
pre-selected
Hmm.
in the moment. How do you hold on to them? Do you write them down? Do you have them on your phone? Do you just you know try to solidify them in your mind?
Yeah, I think if I know that there's like an anticipated conflict, maybe there's like a
Mm-hmm.
situation with a teacher or something
Mm-hmm.
that, or a parent, and there's something that's a really big deal and it
Mm-hmm.
feels really big in my body. I know
Yeah.
I'm going to deeply process it.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I go about it is really deeply processing, how it feels for me, but then also what do I want to communicate?
Yeah.
And if I were them and I were receiving it, how would I want to hear it? And how would I, how could I say it in such a way that it would be, you know, taken and valued. And so then, yeah, I think I just deeply process it. And as I think of key points, I might put them in the notes in my phone and
Mm-hmm.
then kind of add to them. But I know I'm going to be thinking about them. I will.
Absolutely.
So I
How can
kind
we
of
not?
like, I know. So I like to write it down and kind of fine
Mm-hmm.
tune it as I deeply process it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so that it's like we can all get on board with something and it's
Yeah.
not, I'm not letting my delivery undermine my message. I'm
Mm-hmm.
getting clear with them and how we can work as a team.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, just in a kind of way as I can,
Yeah.
if that's, what it calls for. Sometimes it doesn't call for that.
Sure. I appreciate that, taking a moment to think about how will this message be received and do I need to adjust my
Hmm.
delivery to make sure my message is heard. Taking that time. Sometimes, like you're saying, it doesn't happen in quite that way.
Yeah.
Sometimes things are unfolding in the moment. But
Hmm.
even just saying, is there any room to say, oh, I think I need to take a break. I need to come back
Hmm.
to this conversation,
Yeah.
or this is important to me, and I know I need to take a moment to reflect before we continue. There could be ways to build that in
Hmm.
and be able to do your natural processing as an
Yeah.
HSP.
A question that I heard from someone that I loved is in the midst of conflict is to say, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And then it kind of gives you that time and space to kind of calm
Mm-hmm.
down. And it also gives them the ability to clarify what they meant. Because with social
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, we're going to be thinking, they're judging me, they're being critical.
Right.
It was meant to be harsh
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes. But that may not be the case. And we give them the opportunity to say yes or no. And then we can,
Yes.
proceed accordingly. Um,
That is
but
so
yeah.
important. Yeah, to make sure you're clarifying along the way
Hmm.
because the anxiety is going to tell you a different story. And
Absolutely.
check the story out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
saying, what do you mean? Or I think this is what I'm hearing. Is that right?
Exactly. Don't walk
Yeah.
away assuming that this person hates
Right.
you and like,
Exactly.
like
Exactly.
it's not necessarily that.
Right.
It's often usually not that.
It's true. Most of the time, the anxiety has it wrong.
Yeah. Yes, it
It's
is
it's
usually
it's
see.
trying to protect, but a lot of
Hmm.
times it's telling an old story, and yeah, creating opportunities for yourself to see is this actually true?
Hmm.
Get more information. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I
And
love
just like
that.
getting calm in our bodies through that
Mhm.
conflict, I
Mhm.
think is so important. And also, believe this is like a something that Dr. Aaron taught, but like thinking about the volume,
Yes,
like
yes,
this,
of what you're saying.
yeah,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and like sometimes I'll turn up my volume if I know that I'm
Mm-hmm.
speaking to someone who isn't sensitive. I
Which
will like
means directness, right? Not
exactly,
actual volume. Yeah. Okay.
exactly,
Uh-huh.
yes, yes, yeah, directness in my
Mm-hmm.
communication with them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, being like crystal clear and
Mm.
maybe a bit more what to me as an HSP feels kind of abrasive.
Right.
But, even so simple as like, hey, would you mind like scooting back a little bit? I can't see the soccer field,
Right.
like I might feel like abrasive,
Mm-hmm.
but it's for a non-sensitive person, it's like, oh, it was just a
Yeah.
basic request, no big deal. So just like
Exactly.
turning up the volume on that and like my directness as
Yeah.
needed,
Mm-hmm.
not kind of dropping a hint like, oh, it's a little cold in here, or, just,
Exactly.
hey,
Right.
could you turn up the heat? But also for me, it means sometimes turning down the volume on someone else because
Mm-hmm.
they might feel like a 10 out of 10 to me. But then I'll ask
Ooh.
myself, like, are they sensitive?
Mm-hmm.
Like what do I think is the volume that they intended in that
Mm.
comment?
Okay, so when someone is sharing something and maybe they're not highly sensitive or maybe they're sensitive but in an agitated state,
Hmm. Hmm.
you are how do you do that? How do you turn the volume down, their volume down?
I mean, I think I try to put myself in their shoes and I think
Mm-hmm.
about, okay, they're really triggered by this.
Mm-hmm.
Feels really big for them, or they're, I don't experience them as being particularly sensitive. And I think they're just
Mm-hmm.
being like exceptionally direct and it feels a bit abrasive for me.
Yeah.
So as a sensitive person, I'm just going to turn that down to like a 5 because I think that's all that I needed
Yeah.
to take
So
in.
like you zoom out to take in the full context of
Hmm.
their temperaments, their situation, the context in which they're sharing the information.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we can
Yeah.
filter a bit.
Right. I like to do that because I
Yeah.
don't oftentimes, people don't intend for things maybe
Mm-hmm.
to come across as like yelling, or maybe they're in an agitated state and like I don't
Mm-hmm.
need to take that in and take that
Yeah.
on. And so it's kind of that process, sort of like that intervention of like putting the ball on your shoulder, right? It's like
Right.
I don't need to take in that level of it. I'm just going to put it here for a moment and I'm going to turn the
Mm-hmm.
volume down
Oh, I love that.
accordingly.
Right.
And then
Keep
I'm
it
going to take in their
outside.
message. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't like I work hard to like not just absorb things.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this is true for you, but sometimes I need to put the ball of feedback or communication outside of myself for a while as I figure out where I am. Because
Hmm.
sometimes maybe I'm overstimulated. I've just had something emotional happen where I'm feeling tender or vulnerable. So that information sometimes feels more harsh than it's intended, not
Yes,
because of them,
yes.
but because of me.
Yes,
And
yes.
I need
We're
to
in a
take a
more like
moment.
raw state and it just
Right.
things hurt more when there've been other experiences and they're adding up. So it's like
Right.
I'm just going to table this text
Exactly.
message that feels kind of prickly to me right now because I'm
Right.
feeling more raw and exceptionally
Mm-hmm.
sensitive. And I'll get back to that when I'm ready, when I feel like calm and regulated and I can
Exactly.
respond like the way that I want
Mm-hmm.
to.
Exactly. So I think the message here, lots of pauses, permission for lots of
Hmm.
pauses, lots of permission for pauses
Yeah,
across the board in all areas of life as
absolutely.
an HSP. Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that.
And yeah, just a lot of mindfulness. And
Exactly.
and that's I think when we
Permission.
know to
Mm-hmm.
pause, when we're being really present.
Exactly. I love that. I just want to thank you so much. This was such a good conversation, and
Thank
I hope if
you.
you feel comfortable with the process at some point you'll come back and we can
Yeah,
deepen
love
into it.
that. Yeah, I would be
Yeah.
happy to. I love
Yeah.
this whole process and I loved getting to talk with
Same.
you and talk about
Same.
social anxiety and
I
highly
know.
sensitive people.
And all the thing, I mean everything. I was like
Everything.
we could just go for a couple hours on each one
I
of these.
know. I totally could. I
I had to
totally
stop
could.
myself a few times like, okay, I want to go down this rabbit hole, but we may not have time for that.
Me too. And I think
So
I did a
probably
little bit, but
earmark some things to go back into.